There are a lot of challenges going on in higher education right now. I'm hopeful that the industry as a whole will use this opportunity as the opportunity that it is to reform what higher education is, what we can provide to our students, how we can be more accessible while still trying not to escalate costs.
What does it cost? Is it more expensive to reduce the size of the women so that they can make more money, or to just present women the way they are, just present human beings the way they are, no? Instead of this almost experimental type of human being? I don't know how women feel about that. I know how I feel about that certainly, but I'm not a woman. How do you feel about that?
And it seems to be something that the fashion industry does promote a lot more on the thin side than on what I would argue is the healthy side. So when we get into things like the 00, there are very few people who are naturally that size, and they usually are achieving that sort of size. Drug use or eating disorders. So the number of models that are actually that size naturally is very, very small. Harmon, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Wyoming, and I teach in the Family and Consumer Sciences Department in the Design, Merchandising, and Textiles curriculum. It's quite a mouthful every time I introduce myself, so I specifically focus on the textile science aspects and then social psychology of dress. So people's motivations for picking out their clothing. So it really encompasses psychological, sociological, and then social psychological aspects of dress and appearance. So your behavior in a group, your individual behavior, and then what you think about what people think about your behavior, essentially.
I never really pay attention to that part, the psychological aspect of dressing. But why is that so important? Could you expand on that?
I really got interested in it, looking at it from a body image perspective. So when I was sort of coming of age and a teenager, it was sort of an unhealthy environment on social media. Specifically, there was a lot of pro-anorexia content where you would focus on things like thigh gaps and then hip bones, and then the clothing that would accompany those to display those features. So I really got curious, why is this happening? So that was sort of the cultural zeitgeist to sort of be as thin as humanly possible. So that's sort of what started me down this path to try and figure out what was going on with that particular occurrence.
And what did you find out in the course of your study of the situation?
For my dissertation, I looked at that particular material and how long it would be posted on social media. So I was really curious because the social media websites at the time were introducing new disclaimers in their terms of service where that content specifically was not allowed. So it was not supposed to be on their sites. So that's what I investigated during my dissertation. Is it still there? And if it is, how long does it stay up? So what I found was most of the content was taken down. Most of the content was taken down pretty quickly. Some of it remained, and that tended to be the content that had less engagement. So that would have less likes or followers or people just seeing it in general. That indicated to me that people were reporting this content when they came across it.
Now, let's take a moment to look at that again. Was that something that you found more prevalent among women, or was it across all gender, almost equally distributed? Could you speak more on that?
So I would search social media websites that I investigated for specific hashtags. I found the content in those hashtags was primarily female centric. Every now and again, I would come across imagery and text that was geared towards both sexes, but predominantly it was overwhelmingly female audience for that content.
And do you think that there could have been any reason for that, or was it sort of random?
Well, I think when we look at body ideals for men versus women, Thinness is much more heavily emphasized for women as an ideal trait. So for men, it's more emphasized that you should have muscle mass, lean mass, and also muscular mass. But being actually thin, thin enough to see underlying bones, that's something that seems to be isolated to women in terms of what people think is attractive, which is sort of what is gearing all of this. I came across several different posts of content that specifically sort of called out models in the fashion industry about how, you don't see meat on those bones, essentially. So that's sort of what they were looking at as their ideal, the prominent figures at the time. And that, again, for females. Male models do tend to be more slender than your average person in the population who is male. But again, it's not really about that degree of thinness where you can actually see protruding bones.
This is a very important conversation. Actually, this was not what we were going to discuss today, but it actually just came up like this. And I think it's very important because when you observe the model, whether, okay, I'm living in Italy, okay, the model industry is well evolved also here in Italy, talking of Milan, or maybe places like Paris and all of that, and also London, I think. So you see this slender body model, as if those are the only type of human being that actually exist. Whereas when you look at the cross spectrum of the people, you see that that is not the only people that exist. But why is it that that is the type of body that is presented to the media? Sort of this go to condition the way that people behave, as if when your body didn't fall into this type of shape, it is abnormal. So I don't know if that is really important to even talk about, or is it just okay?
Well, I'm grateful that pro-anorexia content is a lot less prevalent now. So they have, it seems like they have better algorithms now to actually detect the content instead of just relying on people reporting it. So I'm grateful that that at least has died down, because anorexia itself is one of the most deadly mental disorders that you can develop. So we don't really need promotional material for such a deadly disorder. I think that this is an important conversation to have because the ideals that we tend to see in media are just drastically unrepresentative of what the actual population looks like. And that does create a lot of dissonance between members of the public and then these media figures.
Mhm. So that at the end of the day, it's not really a representative of what the people really look like. Because okay, sometimes I've seen some model or some fashion company that have deliberately promoted women that have a kind of a little bit of fat in their body. I remember I was reading the book by Obama, and then I think at a point we're making reference of how a typical European or Western people look at the woman body and how an African look at the woman body. That in Africa we tend to want to see more flesh in the woman than what it is seen in the West. So I don't know if this is even a problem for women, because I'm not a woman, so I'm not able to understand that. But I know that as a man, I like to see a little bit more flesh on a woman than just be bone, like what is often presented, very tiny and thin and almost very skeletal as it were, you know. That doesn't appeal to me that much. I want to see a little bit of, okay, I'm not saying that you should be extra large, but at least when I touch somebody, I want to know that I touched somebody. I don't want to feel bone. I want to feel flesh.
Bones are not really very comforting when you reach out for a hug and you just are the receiving end of a bony frame. So that's sort of something that people talk about more in the population, that isn't what they would like to see in their own personal life, or that's not what they're attracted to in a partner. And it seems to be something that the fashion industry does promote a lot more on the thin side than on what I would argue is the healthy side. So when we get into things like the 00, there are very few people who are naturally that size, and they usually are achieving that sort of size. Drug use or eating disorders. So the number of models that are actually that size naturally is very, very small for the number of models that they use in that size category. So that's one of the things that's particularly detrimental when we're seeing all of these models who are that size, and we're not talking about how most of them are not getting there naturally.
If I
So I don't want to,
please go.
discriminate against people who are that small, who are that slender naturally. It's just There are very few of them for the number of them that the industry uses. And I also hear um, that they say that they need models that small just because the fabric that they use for these couture shows is so expensive. And so the bigger the model, the more fabric that you have to use. But there's sort of a line that we're crossing when we're using models this slender and sort of emphasizing that models have to be a certain size for fabric use, that models might compromise their health just to be the size that the designer prefers to save on the cost of fabric.
It's really almost absurd. How could, because the company or the industry want to save money for this, they have to condition women to sort of become the body that they want. What does it cost? Is it more expensive to reduce the size of the women so that they can make more money, or to just present women the way they are, just present human beings the way they are, no? Instead of this almost experimental type of human being? I, I don't, I don't know if, I don't know how women feel about that. I know how I feel about that certainly, but I'm not a woman. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, it's going to be more cost effective for manufacturers to have smaller sizes of clothing produced because fabric is typically the largest cost when we're producing a garment. So the less that they have to use, the less the garment will cost. So for the manufacturer, it's going to be a lot more cost effective to produce a line of clothing that's of smaller sizes than larger.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jennifer. All right, of course, today we are talking about women in the academia. And of course, this was just a kind of a premise. Of course, it's part of it, in the larger part of it, because at the end of the day, we are talking of the importance of women in the academia and the work that they are doing that sometimes is either undervalued, or people don't even pay attention to it, or people don't understand how much they are really doing in the academia. Of course, this conversation started because I was interviewing another professor here who make reference to your article, the article that you posted, talking about the work that women are doing behind the scene or in the academia, and that sometimes is unnoticed. I wanted to start from there. What was the motivation behind that particular post?
Well, I suppose, without giving too many details, to call out anyone in particular, but there was an event that was on our campus last summer, and I really saw that this was an outreach towards incoming students. And I saw that it was primarily organized on the ground by women, except for when you got to the main director of the event, who happened to be a male faculty member, which I thought was very odd because this event took dozens of hours. This was across colleges, across departments, with all the disciplines trying to put on this event for incoming students. So that struck me as really quite strange that these dozens of women who coordinated all of this, they were basically not really seen because the main director of everything for the event happened to be a male faculty member.
So that sort
And
of
that's a
struck you,
similar
right?
pattern.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes, it
I'm
struck me.
listening.
That's just a similar pattern that I've seen. And it's not only women. This also encompasses minority faculty too. Their efforts tend to be a little bit more behind the scenes and not front and center. And, there's debate as to why this is happening. Is this happening because these particular groups on campus just feel more comfortable behind the scenes and they don't want to put themselves out there? Or is this something that's happening for implicit bias where we're looking for the traditional looking professor, which would be an older, typically Caucasian male professor? Is that bias there, or are these individuals who are not being so seen just more comfortable not being seen? So this is sort of what people are trying to figure out with this service distribution, where it seems to be so unheavily weighted towards female and minority faculty.
Okay, so you've been there for some time now. What do you think? Do you think there is a bias there, or is it just a kind of, maybe, sometimes that can be a kind of a mistake within the system, or sometimes it's not a mistake; it's just a part of the design of the system. Do you think your description is a reflection, or maybe there is a bias there, or somebody is just deliberately making it like this, or is a kind of a mistake of one person? Therefore, it's something that can easily be fixed. What is your take on that?
From my perspective, I think that it's a little bit of both. I mean, if you are asked to do something that's behind the scenes, you probably are not going to turn down a service opportunity as a faculty member. And it seems like women get asked to do a lot more service than men. So I'm not really sure from the asking side if women are asked more readily because they usually say yes. And that's just sort of what people think would be the path of least resistance to ask a female faculty member to do this particular service because they typically say yes to that, and the degree to which female faculty are feeling like they are pressured to say yes because their jobs or maybe their promotions would be in jeopardy if they said no. So I think that there's a little bit of both. And then when we're talking about directors, usually when you have more service experience, especially when you're leading a group, these are the people who are going to get turned to have those more visible roles. But if women are sort of on 18 different committees and not focusing on one and having a meaningful, say, a chair position on a committee, it's much less likely they're going to get picked to do something like direct a college, campus, department, discipline wide effort.
All right. So when I was interviewing Professor Adams, she was saying something to the effect that there is a kind of a politics that is sometimes really complicated to play within the academia. That sometimes a lot of women don't know how to play this. Of course, this is why she's out there helping women to sort of level up in their career, to be able to make best use of their time in the academia so that they can get better in what they are doing in the academia. So I remember I did ask her, what are these politics that you need to navigate to be able to, I think she referred to it as play the game, that you need to play the game to be able to, at the end of the day, being able to get what you want instead of just play this subordinate role throughout your stay in the academia. So what is your take on that?
Well, women just by and large, I've noticed in academia and outside of it, we don't do as much self promotion. So you can see this in surveys that they've done about negotiating for starting salaries. Women are much less likely to negotiate up a higher starting salary and ask for raises. So women don't tend to do things that might be perceived as rocking the boat as readily as men do. This just seems to be something that translates across academia into industry as well. So for women specifically, we have to get more comfortable taking the visible roles and asking for them. So if we're waiting for them to be offered, this might not come essentially because if you have been spread on all those service roles, like I mentioned, and you don't have that necessary experience, then you're not going to get the super visible, high profile service roles. And we have to be more comfortable actually asking for those and saying no to lower profile, less visible, time intensive roles. There is some ownership that female faculty do have in mitigating, these political dynamics. People like to think that academia is not a political place, but it's an incredibly political place. I would say it's more political than a lot of industry roles from the former professors that I've been talking to. So it is a lot of political navigating and self-promotion, and that's just sort of a necessary component of the system if you want to move up as any faculty member.
Give me a scenario of how somebody will move up in the academia and what a person will need to do to be able to move up in the right way.
Okay, so if you want to be, say, a department chair, that's usually the first step that someone would take if they're interested in being a higher level college administrator. If you want to be a department chair, first of all, you have to get tenure. So you have to sort of navigate all of that madness when you're a junior faculty. So you have to build a solid research profile. You have to be at least decent at teaching. Most people who get tenure are not terrible teachers, so you can't completely neglect that aspect of the job. So then when you have those two, and you'll have to do some service, preferably service that your own upper administration cares about so that they can sort of see you in that department chair role. You have to network with your dean. You have to network with your dean's boss as much as you can, getting access to higher administration. So you have to be actively involved in all of your college's activities, put on department activities, make friends with all of your colleagues, just have a solid reputation to be eligible to go into that role. Most of the department chairs are internal hires. If you get to be a department chair, then it's easier to move within your college if you have an opening on your dean's roster, I guess, of the different roles that support the dean in their role running the college. So then that's sort of how you climb the hierarchy in higher education. Because these opportunities are sort of shrinking in prevalence, you might have to jump institutions to be able to do this. So I've seen several, I don't know if they'll appreciate me talking about this, but I have seen several faculty leave UW in order to become department chairs at other universities.
And why is that the case? What your study is resulting to this particular situation?
Well, if you have, say, my department has about 9, 10 faculty, there's one department chair. And so if you don't have it written in your university handbook, a specific rotation, so, you serve 4 years as department chair and then somebody else does. The department chairs that we've had previously have served multiple year terms. Someone served, I believe, a 10-year term before I came here. So if you get someone into that role and you don't have it, in stone that it's a rotational role, it just sort of sits with the person who originally got it. Static. It doesn't move. So you don't have the opportunity to do the department chair role in your department at your starting institution. So you might have to go to another one. I had a colleague leave a chair position here just for a better chair position at another institution.
Now, let's talk a little bit about you. Of course, this is what we usually do in the beginning of it, but it's okay. We'll do it in the middle. So, how did you get into the higher education? Tell me more about your motivation, sort of your trajectory.
Well, I'm sort of a product of the Great Recession. I graduated in the aftermath of the Great Recession, and sort of career opportunities weren't really around. So I decided I would go to graduate school and try to wait out the recession, essentially. I didn't actually intend to go and do a PhD and become a professor when I first went to graduate school, but I just fell in love with teaching in graduate school. I got to see light bulb moments of my students, and that was such the most rewarding experience I'd had in my life up to that point. So I decided I would do it. I would go and get the PhD and try to be a professor. And so that's sort of what led me here.
All right. Now, tell me, a young Jennifer growing up, what do you see around you?
I'm from Illinois, so I saw a lot of corn. I saw a lot of corn. My sister actually works for a prominent agricultural equipment company. So, a lot of corn, a lot of agriculture. I grew up in a relatively larger town, so there was some thing to do once in a while. Movie theaters were a lot more prominent. It's just your run-of-the-mill town in Illinois, surrounded
All
by
right.
corn.
Beautiful. Of course, corn is very good. Of course, it's you have a lot of.
I love roasted corn.
That's beautiful. All right. So, as you were growing up, what were you projecting for yourself? I mean, how were you looking at yourself into the future?
Well, I went to college. I was a first generation college student. So I was really excited to be there, and I really loved engaging with ideas on the college campus. And so I always thought that it was a really cool job to be a professor, and I had a good relationship with a lot of my undergraduate professors. So when I was in college, I didn't really have a firm plan for my future. I thought maybe I would own a business, do something entrepreneurial. I thought maybe a restaurant business, because to that point, I had worked for a catering company for 8 years. They were the first one to hire me when I was 15 on my worker's permit. So I thought in college, actually, I might own a business, maybe open a restaurant. Um, but when I graduated into the Great Recession, didn't really seem like a great time for, a 22-year-old to try and start their own business.
All right. Now, as you were moving to the academia, was there anything that actually interested you? Okay, I understand that you love teaching, which is a very important thing, or very a great thing that need to be appreciated. Well, other than that, was there something that was actually like pulling you into the academia and that you can lay hand on?
Well, yeah, as a first generation college student, just being on a college campus in general is always really exciting, and it's full of energy and excitement, especially, when the students either first get there or, at this semester when it's closer to finals week when they're really excited for summer. But there's always some sort of excitement, and the free exchange of ideas I always was really fascinated with. And then with my research program, I really was looking into different ways body image manifests in relation to your personal appearance. So I also did a study when I was in graduate school about obesity bias, trying to figure out if people, if students in our major specifically had any elevated amount of obesity bias than you would expect from a general population. And we luckily found out that they didn't. We thought maybe they would because of the fashion media imagery going on at that time. And we were glad to find out that they did not have that elevated amount of bias.
And why were you interested in body or the dressing, or is it within the discipline of fashion? Were you intending to work in the fashion industry? Tell me what was sort of inspiring you in those areas.
So for me, going to graduate school, I wanted to find out more about the fashion industry, but at the more commercial level. So I wasn't really interested in going to New York and doing an internship for a design firm or something like this. I wanted to know more about the industry at the commercial level. So when I went to graduate school at Ohio State, it was a good place to do that because there was a strong presence of limited brands there. So limited brands does Victoria's Secret, the limited, as you might guess. So there's a good industry presence there. I wanted to understand the barriers to carrying more diverse size ranges because we're having, at the same time as the population is growing in size and more people are overweight or obese from those clinical definitions, we are not having the same amount of accessibility to clothing for these populations, even though they're becoming the majority of the US population. So I wanted to know what is the hang up there in trying to accommodate this large in size or large in number, but also size of the population in proportion. Why can't we accommodate these individuals in the same way we do your straight sizes, is your typical 0 to 10 or 12? So what is the hiccup? What is the barrier there?
All right. Now, you're looking at your students that are coming to learn from you. Tell me about their impression about okay, we were talking about sizes before, Don, that, okay, it would have been normal if people were just presented the way they are instead of this over pruning that they need to sort of fit into a certain boxes that they are presented in those boxes as if that is the normal way of life. Only that people are living in the illusion because when they leave those places, they go into the world, into the normal society in the street of Milan or Paris or New York. They see that the people that they see are different from those they just saw in the demonstration, as it were. So now, okay, as an adult, somebody who have developed your ability to think, you see this is not right. But for the children that are coming to study, what is their impression? What do they think? Are they fit into the narrative of those slim, I don't know, whatever they want to call it, or the normal life of the people that they see outside? What do you say about that?
I'd say our student body where I teach is relatively diverse in size. So I don't really have students who think that the industry ideal of, a size 00 is a good thing. I have more students who are interested in designing for plus size bodies and learning how the pattern making process and how the manufacturing process is just a little bit different for that size range. Then I have students who are really interested in maintaining the unrealistic standards that have been held up for so long. They're starting to become a little less prominent now. But yes, my students are a lot more interested in designing for the full spectrum of sizes and learning about those hiccups that happen when you're designing for larger sizes.
All right. Now, I have a curiosity. Correct me if I'm wrong, that sometimes it is hard. So, if it is hard for you, what motivates you? How do you keep on going as a professor, having all the challenges that, of course, we talked about some of them, and some of them we're going to talk about just now? What motivates you to go on?
What motivates me is I really want to set up my students for success. So I'm a little bit, I guess I would call myself a little OCD about experiential learning because I've found it just to be the best method of learning. Unfortunately, with that method of learning, it takes routinely 5 to 8 times as long to plan something to do in a class session where I'm using that method. So I have to do the lecture that excuse me, I have to do the lecture that that topic is emphasizing. So we have some grounding going into the activity. I have to get all the materials for the activity. I have to test out the activity. I have to bring in all the materials for the activity, do the activity, and then do all of the cleanup. So that takes a lot longer than just, me standing in front of the class and lecturing. But this has been my greatest successes that I've had with this method, especially when I teach in textile science. It's a very dense topic. It's not very approachable. The students, I can see, they just sort of tune out what I'm saying when I'm talking about the chemical aspects of fibers, polymer chain length, amorphous versus crystalline regions in the fiber. They're just like zoning out. So what I've really been focusing on is trying to make that topic a lot more approachable. And it's very successful, and that's very gratifying for me. I get emails from students thanking me for the class, saying that they didn't think they would like the class, which I'm not offended by, I understand. But saying they didn't think they would like the class, but they ended up really enjoying it. And, they're going to remember things going forward, which is really key for me. I don't want them to just take a class to check a box. I want them to learn something and improve their way of thinking or communication skills, something that they're going to take outside of the class that's going to make their lives better in the future. So that's my main motivation and motivating factor. And my love of teaching has really been why I sort of tolerate all the madness that goes on in modern academia, because I just am really grateful to be a part of student enrichment.
Madness going on in the academia. What are you referring to? What does that mean? Explain.
Oh, academia right now is an interesting place to be. So what we're seeing right now in academia and what we're going to see probably for the next 10 years, could be 15, higher education is going through a contraction. And we're going to see more program closures. We're going to see more faculty laid off, even tenured faculty. And we're going to see diminishing student numbers, which is one of the main reasons for this. Most universities, their main source of funding is tuition revenue. So when that starts to diminish, because we have less young people in each generation now, we're going to see program closures, not because the universities are trying to be mean or pick on anybody, but just out of necessity, because they can't keep the entire institution running with all of the departments and disciplines they currently have, because they're not going to have as many students. So right now it's a situation where there are a lot of disciplines who have experienced short staffing, because what they've done recently is they've tried to avoid layoffs by not filling positions that have been open. Unfortunately, that means that the same amount of work is being spread to fewer and fewer people. So it's just creating a lot more overwork than usually even academia has. We're going to see this continue. More than likely, the demographic cliff is something that administrators have been bracing for. They forecasted it to start in 2030, 2035. I would argue it's already here. We're seeing program closures already. We're seeing even, the small liberal arts colleges, some of them have entirely closed. So it's going to be an interesting season for higher education. I think there's a lot of opportunities to reformulate what higher education is. Um, I'm seeing a lot more reactionary budgeting, where you have a budget deficit and you have to react to make up for that budget deficit, than I am proactive budgeting, where we're having these hard conversations about what are we doing that we don't need to do. And the student athletes in my class probably don't appreciate that I pick on athletics, but I will pick on athletics a little bit, because most athletic programs on your average university campus cost a lot more money than they bring in. So do we need to sustain that? Do we have different centers? So there are special interest centers on your average campus. Do we need all of these diverse centers that are in separate buildings that have carrying costs and overhead costs every year? What can we actually get rid of that doesn't diminish the education that we're able to offer? Because that's what I've been seeing recently too, is that they're going to education first to make cuts, which I find kind of ridiculous in higher education, to start cutting the education first.
But what is responsible for it? Is it that people are not giving birth to children anymore, or people are no longer interested in school? What is responsible for this cut?
We have a lot of factors going on that's diminishing the number of students that are coming to campus. So we have lower birth rate. So we just have fewer students who are that traditional college age that are coming to campus. We have graduates who are not being able to get jobs, which is primarily the reason for most of them to go to university. So if they're not graduate, especially right now with the job market being so poor, They go and they get trained for 4 years and then they graduate and they're not able to find jobs. And so we see generations under our current college students watching this saying, why would I go to college and spend, $30 to $70,000 on a degree? I don't even just get a job once I finished it. So there's lack of student interest too. And then there's also, I think, like you mentioned, states are not supporting educational systems like they used to. There have been drastic cuts to higher education in basically every state in the country. So the funding at the state level is drying up. We have less students just in number. And then we also have less of those students who are eligible to come that are interested in coming.
All right, let's talk about technology. Now, there is technology everywhere, particularly AI, which of course started to crop up more in the beginning of this year. Actually, I think it should be towards the ending of last year. Is it affecting the educational sector? Is it affecting you as a professor with all these new technology that are cropping up everywhere today?
Yes.
Please
I can
explain
give a
to
really
us.
short answer to that one. Yes, it is impacting me as a professor. So I need to teach students how to use this technology, which is kind of tricky because it hasn't really been around for that long. And we're also seeing new technology introduced continuously. So it makes it really difficult to try and plan which ones do I think are going to be the most important, which ones do I think are even going to last 5 years, because not all of these that are out there right now are going to be around in 5 years. So trying to figure out which ones to spend time with the students on to teach them so that they know how to use it, because they will be expected to use these increasingly on their jobs. So it impacts my life in that way, but also trying to have the fine line of use the technology, but don't plagiarize. Don't take something directly from ChatGPT and hand it in, or don't take an image generated from Dolly and hand it in as your own. So trying to walk them through, like, what is the appropriate help that the technology can give, and where does it cross the line into you're just basically stealing something from the computer.
That is very interesting. In fact, of course, it's very interesting for the time that we are living in today. Now, how do you teach your students to play by the rule with this technology? So when you tell them, don't just copy from ChatGPT, for example, and send it to me. Maybe, for example, you give them a test. You don't want them to use it, or you want them to use it with moderation. Can you please explain that?
For me, I tell my students, if they're going to use ChatGPT, I want you to use ChatGPT. It's really going to be helpful for you in creating outlines and knowing what you should talk about, and trying to flesh out those ideas. So if you use ChatGPT, I want you to include your logs. So I want you to cite that you use ChatGPT, first of all, and then also include your prompts that you put into the program, and then give me the readout of the responses that it gave to you. So I can sort of walk you through whether or not you made significant amount of changes to now say this work is your own. So for me, I tell them that if they use AI, cite it. That's sort of the basic bare bones that you do when you're trying not to just take credit for work that's not your own. So that's the basic expectation to cite, but I also want to see what it gave you so I can see what you changed and how you changed it.
Mhm. All right, this is my curiosity. What if they didn't show you what they have changed, or they didn't indicate that they have used ChatGPT? How would you know that they have used ChatGPT in response to the question that you have given to them?
Unfortunately, there isn't a great way to detect that right now. They're working on these plagiarism catchers that incorporate AI, but they're not very good at the moment. There's a lot of false positives and false negatives. So there are a lot of problems with the AI plagiarism catchers at the moment. I can tell, probably not 100%, which, for the students watching, no, probably we're not going to see it 100%. But if you have a professor who uses it like I do, so I use it to do things like draft emails and this sort of stuff, I see the language that it puts out. And there are certain word choices that you can pick up on that the program tends to use that aren't, I would argue, necessarily natural in human speech. So the one that it was using was, now I'm not going to remember, it was something like pilgrimage that it was using to describe a journey, which is not really, you wouldn't really say that naturally. in America, when you're writing an essay about a journey, you wouldn't describe it as a pilgrimage or something like this. So there are certain word choices that it uses that are not really natural. There's some sentence structures that it uses that aren't exactly natural. And especially if I've had students, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, I've seen your writing. I can tell if that's not something you would say.
So which means now that you as a professor, you first need to use the chat GTP for you to know what is actually coming from chat GTP. Okay, that is very interesting. Now, in your observation, in your assessment, do you think chat GTP, of course, in line with other AI, they are advantageous to the academic sector or they are not? Are they helpful?
It depends on what we're using it for. My concern for it is that it's going to be increasingly relied on to do teaching, which I'm sure in the future it's not going to make as many errors as it does now. But whenever I've asked it in the past few months, textile science specific questions, it's riddled with inaccuracies. So I'm concerned that it's going to be heavily relied on to do teaching because, what's cheaper than a free application? Um, so I think that that's an inappropriate use of the technology. I think it's really helpful for students when they're learning how to write, outline ideas, especially for typos. So I share with my students prompts that I use in ChatGPT when you feed it text and ask it to identify typos, misspellings, identify sentences that are not clear, that sort of stuff. So it's great as sort of a secondary proofreader. So I think it does have a role as support in the classroom. I'm very concerned that it's going to be relied on to be a primary focus in the classroom from the instructional side because the technology is just not there right now. Maybe it will be in the future, but at the moment, it's definitely not accurate enough to assume that responsibility.
Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. I appreciate that. Of course, now we have talked about different challenges that the women face in the academia. But is it possible to also say that there are some good things that should encourage women to get more into the academia? What are the advantages of women being in the academia?
Well, for me, it's really the teaching aspect is the main draw for me. The system itself, I don't think for male or female professors is very forgiving system. It's a very intense job to have. It's a very there are a lot of high expectations of you when you assume a role like this. So, from the professional standpoint, one of the main things that was a draw is tenure, and that's being increasingly undermined across the country. So, from an employment standpoint, if you really love academic research or teaching, there's no better place to do that than as a tenured professor at a university. Um, there are a lot of challenges going on right now. So I would hesitate to say that it's a good time to join higher education for anyone that's sort of looking into the industry. And I give this advice to my graduate students too, that, we're going through a contraction. It's going to continue. Jobs are going to be harder to get. So just you have to prepare to have a plan B. If you really have an undying love of teaching and research at the collegiate level, there's no better place to do that than as a tenured university professor. There are also a lot of challenges that you'll have to encounter as part and parcel of assuming that role in this particular environment.
Thank you so much for that. All right, now we fast track back in the past. If you were to make the same step again to become a player in the academia, would you make it? If not, why?
Well, it's a difficult question. We've had program cuts at the University of Wyoming too, so I've had to sort of envision what else would I do if I wasn't doing this. Teaching for me is still a big driver. I don't know where I would get that satisfaction of sort of seeing students have their light bulb moments. I don't know where else I would get something that's so meaningful to me outside of academia. So for that, I think I would still make this decision if I were to do it all over again. But yes, I think at this particular time, it's a very difficult time to join. And we've seen with program contractions and tenured professors being laid off, what that's sort of doing is it's raising the barrier to entry even higher. So you're going to have, when you go for, your assistant level interview, for potential professor position. You might be competing with people who are professors at other institutions who are facing financial difficulty and their programs are closing. Or you might be facing competition from professors who want to switch universities because they don't like something that's going on at theirs. You might have that competition from lecturers or, people who have had multiple postdocs. So the barrier to entry is not you get out of graduate school and you are qualified for an assistant professor position so much anymore, because there's just, especially right now, there are a lot of people, talented people, who are looking to change universities or who have been laid off, which is making it even harder for, the young recent graduates to join.
Now, for you personally, what do you see the future? What is the plan? Where are you headed to now?
What I'm doing right now, I'm co-chair of Heterodox Academy chapter here at UW, which is it's a organization that's dedicated to constructive dialogue, freedom of expression, free speech, critical thinking. So discussing important ideas on a college campus in a respectful manner. So you might have picked up on the fact that I'm a big fan of freedom of expression and free speech, and I exercise that regularly. So I'm involved with that at the moment on the service aspect. Research, I'm wrapping up a project with non-binary individuals. This is sort of a team across institutions, and we're looking at some of the barriers to them maintaining and forming a positive body image. So our second piece from that data set we're working on now. And then teaching wise, I'm still just working on making textile science as engaging as I can and hoping that students are still enjoying that aspect of it, getting their hands in the midst of all of this sort of stuff. So they have a better understanding of it, because when I talk about things like there's a warp and a weft and a loom, and when you just show a picture on a slide, they're like, oh, that's great, but what does that mean? And then they don't know when they look at a piece of fabric which direction is which. It's different when you have them weave a piece of fabric. Then they're like, oh, that makes sense. So I'm just still working on trying to make that as engaging as I can, which it just involves a lot of student activities, which luckily they seem to enjoy a lot more than just listening to my voice, especially today, as it's a little bit hoarse from this cold I caught from my kids. So
Oh, well, it's part of life. It's part of life. Even here in Italy today, it's beginning to get a little bit more cold. Anyway, we're supposed to be moving away from cold, but anyway, it's okay. It's normal. That is life. All right. So now, people that want to connect with you, how can they get to connect more with you? Of course, there are a lot of things I would have liked to ask you, but I know that the time is sort of straight. So yeah,
sure, I'd love to come back on again, maybe after finals week.
that
We
would be
can have a
lovely.
longer conversation. But if you want to get into contact with me, my LinkedIn profile is pretty visible if you are a member of that site, or if not, my personal email is just my name, JLHARMO @gmail.com. So I welcome any sort of inquiries about the conversation that we had today. I love to discuss important ideas, and that is one of the perks of being a professor too, is that I get to think about this stuff and I get to have conversations about meaningful topics.
That's lovely. That's lovely. All right. So thank you so much, Dr. Jennifer. So what would be your final thought here to the conversation that we have had today?
Well, I would say that there are a lot of challenges going on in higher education right now. I'm hopeful that the industry as a whole will use this opportunity as just the opportunity that it is to reform what higher education is, what we can provide to our students, how we can be more accessible while still trying not to escalate costs. So I'm hopeful that that's how the industry will embrace this. And we'll just have to stay tuned and see what happens.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and also the sharing here. It's been a pleasure here.
It was really nice to talk to you today. And again, I'd love to come on maybe after, finals week and we can have a longer conversation.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to that.